Ah, a Range Rover, the pinnacle of comfort, capability, and sophistication. This one is mine, a 2011 that I bought sight unseen at an auction for only $2,000. My name is Waldo, and in part 1 we managed to get this vehicle running, but we discovered that it has an engine knock. In this video, we're going to see if we can discover the cause of the engine knock to repair it. Using an endoscope camera, we also discovered some scoring on the cylinder walls, so the first thing we need to do is check the compression to see if this engine is healthy enough to be worth saving. So it is the beginning of deer fly season, so I definitely want to get this thing in the shop to work on it. So I do have some good news to report, and that is while I was working on another project, this vehicle sat for a couple weeks, and here's a picture of it. You can see that the air suspension doesn't look like it collapsed at all, which is really good news. Also on a positive note, the engine seems to run well, other than the knocking noise, so I have high hopes that the compression test will give good results. Now, in order to do a compression test, I have to remove the spark plugs, which I have done, and I also have to remove the fuel pump relay, which I will do. Fuel pump R5. This test kit has the adapters you need to test just about anything, so I will put a link in the description below. Well, that gave about 215 psi, which is excellent. Let's see what the other ones are. So I tested the compression on all 8 cylinders, and the highest was 235 psi, and the lowest was 200 psi. The next one above this cylinder was 210 psi, and so cylinder number 7 here does stand out a little bit as having the lowest compression. However, I'm not too concerned about it. I also went ahead and got the test long back out and took a look inside cylinder number 7, and I didn't see any issues in there, so I think we're going to go ahead and say that the compression is healthy enough on this engine to move forward. While I have the spark plugs out, I figured it would be a good opportunity to inspect the movement of all of the valves while I turn the engine over by hand. These are a pair of exhaust valves. Here you can see the exhaust valves start to open. I move the camera a little bit to get a better view. The valves start to close as the piston approaches the top of its stroke. All of the valves seem to move normally with no sign of hitting any pistons. Also, while I was in there with the test long, I noticed that the cylinder scoring is actually only on the left bank of the engine, and the right bank, which is the passenger side here in the US, had very little scoring on it. So next I am going to do something that, quite frankly, I should have done pretty early on, and that is I'm going to use my mechanic's stethoscope here to try to pinpoint exactly where the noise is coming from. What I observed with the mechanic's stethoscope is really strange because when I first heard this knocking noise with my own ears, it sounded like it was coming from the top of the engine and on the left-hand side. However, with the mechanic's stethoscope, what I heard was totally different. It was a noise that was coming from the front of the engine on both sides, sort of in the area of the timing chain. This makes me wonder if there are a couple different noises, but the main knocking noise goes away after the engine warms up. To find out for sure, I let the engine cool overnight, and I also got the vehicle up on the lift so I can have a listen underneath to determine if the noise is coming from the top or bottom of the engine. I think I can say with a fair amount of certainty that the noise is coming from the top part of the engine because it's fairly quiet down here and I didn't hear any unusual noises. That's really good news because the top half of the engine is a lot more accessible than the lower half of the engine. Any issues with the lower half of the engine typically require full disassembly and perhaps a full rebuild as well. As for the noise itself, it really doesn't sound as bad as I remember it being, and the engine was completely cold. I mean, it sat all night, overnight, and it's not exactly warm outside, hence I'm wearing a sweatshirt. While I have this thing on the lift, it's probably a good idea to get underneath it to see what kind of condition it's in under here. And my initial impression is that it is pretty good. We have a little bit of surface rust on the subframe, but that is to be expected on a vehicle from the Northeast. I don't see any leaks here on the transmission. The transfer case looks like that's in pretty good shape. Moving farther to the back, the exhaust looks like it's also in good shape. All of the CV boots are in good shape. The control arm bushings themselves look good. And in fact, the steering and suspension in general is nice and tight. The brakes aren't exactly new, but they're still within spec. Yeah, I really only noticed a couple things that need to be addressed before this thing will pass inspection, and the first are the tires. Those are pretty bald, especially on the edges, which indicates this thing probably needs an alignment. The second thing, this shock right here looks like it's leaking from the top, so that'll need to be replaced. Luckily, this is just a regular old shock. The air spring is back there, and that is in good shape.
I've been putting a lot of thought into what's causing this noise. I've considered everything from piston slap to bad bearings to valve train noise, and I'm still not sure of the cause. I've heard on the interwebs that these engines are very sensitive to bad oil, and I've heard of cases where noises have been resolved by simply doing an oil change. I think at this point, that's probably the next step.
All right, changing the oil with the fluid evacuator here. If you saw part one, then you saw me getting it done with this thing. Stick this piece of tube over that piece of tube. Well, that's about it. We're sucking up air now, so that's all the oil it had in it. As for the filter, I don't have the exact socket that's needed for this, but I do have this generic one, and let's see if it works for this. This is the only oil filter wrench that I use nowadays because it works so well for all sorts of different oil filters, and this is no exception. It works for this as well. Yeah, that's an oil filter. There's the replacement. New O-ring. See if I can coat this new O-ring with a little bit of oil before I install it. Made in Jordan. That's weird. Using Castrol Edge 5W20, this should fit the bill. Well, let's start it up and see what happens. Well, I am almost at a loss for words. The noise went away almost immediately after I started it up, as if the oil level or maybe the oil quality did indeed cause that issue. Now, the noise that's left over, I can distinctly hear the rattle of a timing chain, so I think this engine probably does need some help in the timing department, but that's kind of what I expected to do going into this anyway, so I'm very happy about the results here. The left timing chain is visible from the oil fill cap, and it does appear to be moving somewhat erratically, which suggests that there is slack in the chain. You can also hear from the exhaust that the engine is running a little bit weird. It sounds like what one would expect if the timing is off. I just went ahead and ordered a timing parts kit from Atlantic British, and it contains all the stuff I'll need to fix the timing, like timing chains, tensioners, and quite a bit more. The parts kit won't be here until next week, so that's going to have to wait for part 3 of this video series. The installation itself is a pretty difficult job. The factory repair manual says it takes 12.2 hours of labor, and it also takes quite a lot of special tools. And speaking of tools, I'm going to go ahead and put a link down in the description to the tools that I used in this video. Some of those tools are really awesome and life-changing, so you might want to check them out. In any case, thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in part 3.